My first interaction with Pixar was through its movies, and its movies captured my imagination in a very unique way by making toys speak, fish speak, ants speak, and so on and on and on.
I gotta find my son Nemo!
Squish him.
Recon Plan Charlie, execute! Move, 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 move!
Now back then I was just 10-12 years old, so I enjoyed their movies, but I completely missed the business aspects of Pixar. This is where my second interaction with Pixar begins, when I started to understand the business aspects of Pixar. And similar to its movies, the business aspects of Pixar captured my imagination, and many things about Pixar's business surprised me. For example, Steve Jobs was the CEO of Pixar, the man behind Apple and who gave us the iPod, the iPhone and the iPad. Surprisingly, Steve Jobs was also the CEO of Pixar and made movies like Toy Story, Finding Nemo.
As you know, I'm the chairman and CEO of a company called Pixar, and thank you.
Pixar went on to create the world's first computer-animated feature film, Toy Story.
I think it's only the second time that a computer-animated film has ever been nominated.
Now, why did Steve make movies? And interestingly, Pixar's IPO was the one which made Steve billionaire and not Apple. And talking about Pixar's IPO itself is an interesting case study filled with learnings. Because in 1991, Pixar was close to bankruptcy with about $50 million in losses. But within just next 4 years, in 1995, Toy Story was released, which made about a global box office about $300 million, and in the same year, Pixar went public, which was the biggest IPO in the year, bigger than Netscape. Now the question is, why did Steve make movies? And how a company close to bankruptcy became a multi-billion-dollar company, and most importantly, what can you and me learn from the story of Pixar? Well, tie your seatbelts and get ready for a roller coaster ride, because that is what the story of Pixar is all about. Well, to understand the story of Pixar, we need to understand the difference between traditional animation and computer animation. In traditional animation, what happens is, there is 4 steps. Step number 1, the animator hand draws the character.
The skilled artists who draw every movement in complete detail, just as you will see it in the theater.
In step number 2, the animator draws the background.
In the department of the big Disney studio, artists delicately paint the beautiful stage settings for the picture. These backgrounds are done in watercolor.
Then the animator uses a machine to bring the background and character together.
Here the operator puts a Donald Duck celluloid on top of a background as the overhead camera exposes one frame of film. To photograph Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, this operation had to be repeated more than 500,000 times.
Then finally, music is added to the movie. But in computer animation, what happens is, all these steps can be done using a computer.
So now if I want him to smile, I can just grab one of his smile controls, turn that up. Ta-da. Let me have him smile on the other side as well.
Now there were movies like Snow White, Pinocchio, Jungle Book, and Sleeping Beauty which were done on traditional animation, but there was no computer animated film. So the vision of Dr. Ed Catmull was to create a 100% computer animated full-length feature film. And while trying to make the first computer animated feature film while working at Lucasfilm Limited, Ed and his team understood that the computers at the time were too slow and it would take them almost a decade to make a computer animated movie. And as a solution to this problem, they came out with an idea to design their own computer. And you know what? They were successful in designing a new computer and named the computer as the Pixar Image Computer. Now this computer was designed by a small group of people whose aim was not to sell computers but was to just make a computer animated movie. They designed the computer because they found that the existing computers was too slow to make computer animated movies. But you know what? Surprisingly, this computer impressed many big names from the computing industry. And one among them was Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple Computers. To give you a little context about Steve Jobs co-founded Apple Computers in the year 1976. And within a decade, Apple became a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. So Steve had closely worked with computers for the last 10 years, starting with Apple I, Apple II, Apple Lisa, and the Apple Macintosh. So Steve knew about computers in and out. And when Steve had heard about the Pixar Image computer, Steve wanted to see the Pixar Image computer and judge for himself whether the Pixar Image computer was worth the goodwill that it was getting. So Steve decided to visit the Pixar Image computer. And you know what? Even though Steve had 10 years of experience working with computers, when Steve saw the Pixar Image computer, he was impressed, and in his own words, he was blown away.
I was blown away. I spent a lot of time in computer graphics with the Macintosh and the laser writer and stuff, but this was way beyond anything I'd seen.
Now, if someone like Steve Jobs is telling that a computer blew off his mind, then there must be something special about the computer, right? Because after all, Steve had worked with computers for the last 10 years. Now, the important question to ask here is, if Steve was so impressed with the Pixar computer, then what was he planning with the computer? Unfortunately, as it happened to be, during this same time period, Steve was fired from Apple. Now, here are some magazines reporting Steve firing from back in the days. Those Apple computers fired Steve, but Steve was still in love with computers. So this is what Steve plans to do with the Pixar Image computer. What he decided was, he decided to acquire the Pixar Image computer along with the people who designed the computer to start a new computer company to compete with Apple. It was Steve versus Apple. So this is how Steve Jobs got into Pixar. He got into Pixar mainly because of computer and its associated technology and not because of movies.
Yeah, I got into this because of the technology at the beginning.
Now, if Steve got into this because of computer and its associated technology, why don't we see Pixar computers today in the market? Just like how we see HP, Dell, or even Apple. Now, as it happens to be, as soon as Steve Jobs acquired Pixar, Pixar started selling computers. Now, here is an advertisement from Pixar Computer back in the days.
The new lower-priced Pixar 2 and includes a C compiler and software toolkits for developing specific applications. Pixar's image computers are being used in medical imaging, remote sensing, graphic arts including 3D design and animation, and scientific visualization.
Now, if they started selling Pixar computers in the market, then what happened? Why don't we see Pixar computers today in the market? Now, as it happens to be, Pixar could never become like Apple. The Pixar computer failed in the market. In its entire lifetime, only about 300 computers were sold. Now, why did the Pixar computer fail? The Pixar computer was too highly priced. It was about $135,000 back in the days, which was too high, making it to sell only 300 computers in its entire lifetime. It was a difficult time for Steve because Steve had acquired Pixar for its computer and its associated technology. But because the computers did not sell well in the market, the computer division of Pixar was sold to Vcom Systems for $2 million in 1990. And you know what? During this time, Steve's relationship with Pixar's employees was also not very good. And as a continuity to it, Pixar's employee didn't want Steve to be full-time around the office.
And I've got a good relationship with Steve, and all of us too, but we didn't want him there full-time. All right, he was really good part-time, because he faced hours.
So it was a difficult time to keep the team together. And during those tough times, what the team used to do was make short films. Now, why did they make short films? They made short films to move one step closer towards the dream of making computer animated feature film. And one of the films that they made during that time was Tin Toy. Now, Tin Toy was about a baby and his toys. Tin Toy had some early features of Toy Story like toy showing fear, excitement, etc. And you know what? Surprisingly, Tin Toy won Oscars.
And the Oscar goes to Tin Toy, John Lasseter, and William Reed. Now, this was a pivotal movement for Pixar. Though Pixar's image computer failed in the market, but Pixar's short film won Oscars. And you know what? This Oscars got the attention of Disney, the king of traditional animation, who made super hit traditional movies like Cinderella, Jungle Book. Now, Disney understood that computer animation was the next big thing in animation. And it also understood that Pixar was the leading player in it. And in order to do experiment with computer animation, Disney signed an agreement with Pixar. Now, you know what? It might sound good, right? Like the deal from Disney would put the money for production, Pixar would make the movie. But as it happens to be, there's no free lunch, specifically if it's coming from a big company like Disney. Now, what was the catch? According to the agreement, Disney would put the money for production and Pixar would make the movie. But the catch is that Pixar would only get 5% of the profits. To explain the profits, if a movie made $100 million, Pixar would only make 5% of $100 million, that is $5 million. But on the other hand, Disney would keep $95 million of the profit to itself on the movie that was made by Pixar. And to make it worse, the Pixar-Disney agreement would last for 3 films, which meant in film 1 Pixar would get 5% of profits, then in film 2 also Pixar would get 5% profit, and further, in film 3 also Pixar would only get 5% of the profit. Further, the agreement also had something called as exclusive clause. Now, what is exclusive clause? Exclusive clause means that till the completion of 3 films, Pixar could work only with Disney, which meant that even if Pixar got a better deal from other studio like Warner Bros, Pixar could not switch and had to work with Disney only. To summarize the deal, Disney would put the money for production, Pixar would make the movie, but the catch is that Pixar would get approximately 5% in profit. And till the completion of 3 films, Pixar would only work with Disney, which meant even if other studios like Warner Bros were ready to give 50% profit share, up from 5% what Disney was giving, Pixar could not select Warner Bros and had to work with Disney only. Now, this was not at all a good deal. I'm not saying this. Pixar's president Ed Catmull said himself.
But the deal that we had with Disney, frankly, was not a very good deal. We got like 3 to 5% of the profit or something like that. So it was not all that.
Not very good.
Not very good.
Now, if it was not a good deal, then why did Pixar and Steve Jobs agree to it? As it turns out, back then in 1991, Pixar was in a very bad financial condition. Back then, Pixar could be majorly divided into 4 parts. Number 1, computer hardware, which was sold to VCom systems, so there was no revenue from it. Secondly, Pixar used to make short films, but short films were no revenue source, instead it was cash burn. Short films were just for experimenting and award functions. Thirdly, Pixar used to sell prepackaged software called RenderMan. And RenderMan was used to create VFX in movies and was used to draw dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And further, RenderMan was also used for VFX in Terminator 2. Now, though RenderMan was used in big Hollywood movies like Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, RenderMan had a problem. The problem was that not all movies used VFX. So the market size of RenderMan was very small. Fourth, Pixar used to make computer animated commercials for companies like Tropicana, Coca-Cola, etc. Now here are advertisement of Tropicana and Coca-Cola that Pixar made back in the days.
Secret weapon.
But you know what? Even though Pixar made commercials for big names like Tropicana and Coca-Cola, and its software were used in big Hollywood movies like Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, but the revenue from computer animated commercials and softwares was not enough to make Pixar profitable. And because Pixar was not profitable, even very basic expenses of Pixar like electricity bill, rent and salary were paid by Steve Jobs' personal money instead of Pixar's revenue. Are you understanding here what's happening here? Because Pixar was not profitable, Steve was putting his personal money every month in the company. And just by putting his personal money every month, Steve had invested about $50 million in Pixar. But for this $50 million that Steve had invested, he had not even made $1 profit from Pixar. Further, he had to keep on investing every month to keep Pixar alive. And would never know when will Pixar become profitable or will it even ever become profitable. This is when Disney came along and offered to give 100% of production cost to Pixar for making computer animated movie. Now, though it was not a good deal, but Steve had to agree to it because if he did not agree to Disney deal, Steve would have to continue investing every month in Pixar, but would never know when will Pixar become profitable. This is why Steve and Pixar agreed to a bad deal with Disney. But you know what? In next 4 years, this same company with same bad deal with Disney, where Disney kept 95% of profits, would make Steve a billionaire. Now the question is, how did Pixar with bad deal with Disney make Steve a billionaire? As it turns out, Steve Jobs understood numbers, that even if Pixar's movie made $100 million, Pixar would make only 5% of $100 million, that is $5 million. And further, it took 4 years to make a movie, so in a year Pixar would make only $1 million. But Steve had already put $50 million in Pixar. So in order to monetize the success of Pixar, Steve had to think of some other way. This is when he came up with a plan to take Pixar public. Except there was one problem. In order to take the company public, the company had to have stable income. But Pixar had no stable income. Instead, it was 50 million in losses. But anyways, Steve decided to go ahead with Pixar's IPO. And 29th November 1995 was set as opening date for Pixar's IPO. And because Pixar was 50 million in losses and they had own and only Toy Story to show to the public, the IPO date was set 1 week after Toy Story release. That is, Toy Story would release on 22nd November 1995 and Pixar's IPO would open on 29th November 1995. In this 1 week, if Toy Story becomes a hit, there were chances of public offering becoming successful. But if Toy Story becomes a flop, then there was no chance of public offering becoming successful. The entire future of Pixar was dependent on the success of Toy Story. $50 million that Steve had put in, thousands of hours that Pixar's employees had put in, the future of computer animation, all dependent on the success of Toy Story. And as planned, Toy Story was released on 22nd November 1995. The tensions were all-time high, whether the movie would become a hit or flop. And you know what?
A cowboy named Woody, with a voice by Tom Hanks, is the king of the other toys in the bedroom of a little boy who owns them. When the kid is out of the room, the toys come alive and they have some terrific adventures in Toy Story.
Toy Story took the world by wonder. Everyone from child to adult liked the movie.
Kids will probably enjoy it on that level, but for grown-ups, the movie may be even more amazing because this is the first feature-length film made entirely by computers, every single frame.
Toy Story became a very big hit and globally made about $300 million.
The film earned over $192 million domestically, more than $300 million internationally.
The movie was a success, but now the time was for IPO. And guess what? Not only Toy Story was successful, but even Pixar's IPO was successful. Not only successful, it was the biggest IPO of the year in Nasdaq, even bigger than Netscape. The timing of IPO was excellent. It was perfectly matched with the release of Toy Story, and Toy Story's success and hype was used to raise money from public. And Pixar's IPO made Steve a billionaire and saved all of his money that he had invested in Pixar. So this is how Steve Jobs and Pixar were able to monetize Toy Story's success by taking Pixar public. And if you notice, the timing of IPO was perfectly matched with the release of Toy Story. That is, 29th November was the date of IPO and 22nd November was release of Toy Story. And if the IPO date was before 1 month or after 1 month from the release of Toy Story, then the IPO would have not become successful because Pixar had nothing else to show to the public other than Toy Story. So matching the timing of IPO with the release of Toy Story was a genius move by Steve Jobs. This genius move and the story of Pixar's IPO would be studied for years to come and wondered how did Steve Jobs do this. Now though this time Steve Jobs was able to save Pixar by taking Pixar public on the back of Toy Story's success, but the bad deal with Disney continued, where Pixar was only getting 5% of profit. So Pixar wanted to renegotiate with Disney and wanted 50% of profit share in place of existing 5%. Except there was one problem. Why would Disney renegotiate? Disney had no obligation to change the contract. The Pixar agreement was a perfect deal for Disney. It would get 95% of profit on movie that Pixar made, and poor Pixar would only get 5% of profit. And further, Disney had no obligation to change the agreement and give 50% profit share to Pixar. But as it happened, Disney agreed to renegotiate and gave Pixar 50% profit. Now the question is, how did Pixar convince Disney to give 50% profit in place of existing 5%? And if you remember, according to the current agreement, Disney would put the money for production, Pixar would make the movie, and Pixar would get 5% in profit share. Now back then Pixar had agreed to this because their financial condition was bad. But now Pixar had the money to produce movie because they had raised money from public using Toy Story's success. So now Pixar wanted the following changes. Number 1, instead of Disney paying completely for the production, Pixar would pay 50% of production. Secondly, Pixar would continue to make movies. That is, there would be no change in second clause. Thirdly, because now Pixar was paying 50% of production, Pixar wanted 50% of profits instead of existing 5%. Now, Pixar was asking Disney to increase Pixar's profit share from 5 to 50%, which was too much. But you know what? Because Pixar was putting 50% production cost of the movie, Disney agreed to give 50% profit share to Pixar, which meant if Pixar movie made $100 million, Pixar would get $50 million under the new terms instead of $5 million under the old terms. That is a straight away 45% increase in profit share. And that's a big thing. So this is how Steve Jobs and Pixar used Disney's money to make Toy Story, and using that success of Toy Story raised money from public, and using the money raised was able to renegotiate with Disney and got 50% profit in place of existing 5%, which is completely genius. Now, not just Pixar was successful in renegotiating the deal with Disney, back to back all movies released by Pixar were super duper hits. Toy Story 2 made $500 million globally. Monsters Incorporated made $560 million. Finding Nemo made $936 million, just a few million dollars short of $1 billion. It was a good time not only for Pixar but also for Steve Jobs, because Apple acquired Next, another computer company that Steve Jobs had co-founded, and Steve Jobs rejoined Apple in 1997 and saved Apple from bankruptcy by releasing products like iPod, iPhone, etc. and was famously known for product launches and demonstrations. But you know what happened to Pixar after that? Bob Iger, the new CEO of Disney, decided to acquire Pixar for $7.4 billion. And after the acquisition, the Pixar brand was kept separate from Disney Animations, and Pixar continued to make movies and made about $14.7 billion in box office. Well, this is where the story of Pixar completes its full circle. From being so close to bankruptcy to releasing back-to-back blockbusters, then eventually getting acquired by the legendary Disney itself. That's it for the story of Pixar. Now coming to the most important part of episode, that is the learnings and the study material to help you learn more about Pixar. Let's start with learnings. Now what should we learn from Pixar? One thing that we should learn from Pixar is being passionate towards work. It is said that passion can create wonders, and that is so true in case of Pixar. Pixar wanted to make computer animated movies, but the computers at the time were too slow, so they designed a new computer to make their movies. Well, that is the power of passion. It makes unbelievable things possible. So, one thing that we should learn from Pixar is being passionate towards work. That's it for learnings. Before I say goodbye, I would recommend you to read this book, To Pixar and Beyond by Lawrence Levy, which is what I used for the research of this video. That's it for the video. Thank you for making it till here, and keep learning about business.